There's something strange about children who learn to disappear, not physically, but emotionally. They become so good at taking up less space that one day they look in the mirror and realize they've been living their entire life like an apology. They don't scream when they're hurt. They don't ask for what they need. They simply fade, and the world keeps spinning, never noticing the quiet absence of someone who was always there. But here's what most people miss. This wasn't a choice, it was survival. Picture this. A child sits at the dinner table, excitement bubbling inside them. They want to share something, a thought, a story. Maybe just a feeling that's been sitting heavy in their chest all day. They open their mouth, but the conversation moves around them like water around stone. Their words dissolve before they even land. So they close their mouth, and something inside them closes too. Now imagine this happening not once, not twice, but hundreds of times across childhood, each silence carving a little deeper, each dismissal teaching them the same quiet lesson. Maybe I'm not meant to be heard. This is the psychology of the neglected child. Not abandoned, not abused in ways the world would recognize, just overlooked. And that subtlety is exactly what makes it so devastating. Because when no one sees you, you start to believe you're not worth seeing. Here's what's hard to explain about neglect. There's no bruise to point to, no moment you can circle on a calendar and say, that's when it happened. It's the accumulation of nothing, the unanswered questions, the forgotten promises. The parent who was physically present but emotionally unreachable, like a ghost occupying the same house. Psychologists call it emotional neglect, but that phrase feels too clinical for something so soul-crushing. Because what it really is learning that your existence is background noise. And the child's brain, desperate to make sense of this, reaches one devastating conclusion. If no one notices me, I must not matter. But here's where it gets strange. The brain doesn't just accept this once and move on. It rewires itself around it. Neuroscientists have found that when a child's bids for connection are repeatedly ignored, their nervous system starts treating emotional need itself as dangerous. The stress response activates, cortisol floods their tiny body. Their baseline shifts from safety to vigilance. They're not just sad, they're in a constant state of bracing for disappointment. Over time, this becomes their operating system. They stop reaching out. They stop expecting warmth. They learn to need nothing from anyone because needing always led to emptiness. And the heartbreaking part? From the outside, they just look like a well-behaved, quiet kid. So what does a neglected child do to survive? They adapt, and sometimes those adaptations look impressive. Some become fiercely independent. They learn to dress themselves early, make their own meals, solve their own problems. People call them mature for their age. But inside, they're just terrified of being a burden. Others become high achievers. Straight A's, perfect behavior. Anything to finally earn the attention that should have been given freely. But no achievement ever feels like enough because they're trying to fill a void that grades can't touch. Then there are the peacekeepers. The ones who smooth over every conflict, who make themselves small so everyone else can be comfortable. They become experts at reading rooms, sensing tension, managing emotions that aren't even theirs. These children grow into adults who are exhausted by their own competence. Because beneath all that strength is a question they've been asking since childhood. If I stop performing, will anyone stay? Most people don't realize they're carrying childhood neglect into adulthood. They just think something is wrong with them. Why do I feel lonely even when I'm surrounded by people? Why can't I accept a compliment without dismissing it? Why does asking for help feel like pulling teeth? The neglected child becomes the adult who apologizes for existing, who downplays their pain, who says I'm fine so automatically they forget what the truth even feels like. They walk into relationships already convinced they're too much or not enough. They succeed at something and feel nothing because they learned long ago that achievements disappear into silence. And the cruelest part? They often blame themselves. They think, I'm just bad at relationships, or I'm naturally anxious, without ever connecting it back to the child who sat alone, waiting for someone to notice. The neglected child doesn't just lose confidence, they lose their sense of self, because identity forms in relationship. A child learns who they are by being seen. Their joy is reflected back. Their sadness is held. Their quirks are celebrated. And through that mirroring, they begin to understand, this is me. I am real. But when there's no mirror, when their emotions float into space unreceived, they become strangers to themselves. This is why so many adults who grew up neglected struggle with the question, who am I? They've spent so long adapting to others, performing for attention, or hiding to avoid disappointment that they never got to just be. And discovering yourself at 30 feels like learning to walk when everyone else has been running for years. Here's something beautiful and tragic at once. Neglected children often grow into the most empathetic adults you'll ever meet. They have this uncanny ability to sense what others are feeling. They notice the slight change in tone, the shift in body language, the things someone isn't saying, because they had to. Their survival depended on reading the emotional temperature of the room, knowing when it was safe to speak or when silence was the only option. This hyper-awareness becomes their superpower. They're the friend who always knows when something's wrong, the partner who notices the smallest shifts, the co-worker everyone confides in, but it comes at a cost. They tune into everyone else while tuning out themselves. They become so good at holding space for others that they forget they need space too. And eventually they collapse under the weight of everyone else's emotions while their own remain buried. So where does healing begin? Not with fixing, not with becoming someone new. It begins with one simple, revolutionary act, acknowledgement. Saying to yourself, maybe for the first time, what happened to me was real. My pain is valid. I deserved better. Because the neglected child is still inside you waiting, not for someone else to finally notice them, but for you to turn around and say, I see you now. That child who sat quietly, hoping someone would ask how their day was. That teenager who stopped sharing their dreams because no one seemed to care. That young adult who learned to shrink so others could shine. They're all still there. And healing is about giving them the voice they never had. Healing doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like tiny, courageous acts. It's telling a friend, I need you to listen right now, even though your throat tightens with fear. It's setting a boundary instead of disappearing to keep the peace. It's celebrating your own wins before checking if anyone else noticed. It's whispering to yourself in the mirror, my feelings matter. Even if no one taught me that, these moments might seem small. But they're everything, because they're pushing back against years of silence, years of making yourself invisible, years of believing you were asking for too much by simply existing. And every time you speak up and survive it, every time you share a need and it's met with care, your brain starts to rewrite the story. Safety becomes possible again. Connection stops feeling like a trap. And slowly, the nervous system that learned to expect neglect begins to remember how to trust. The truth about neglected children is this: they were never broken, they were just unwitnessed. And there's a profound difference between those two things. Broken suggests something shattered beyond repair, but unwitnessed, that just means no one was paying attention. It doesn't mean the beauty wasn't there. It doesn't mean the worth wasn't real. It just means it went unseen. And the remarkable thing about humans is this: we can learn to see ourselves, even if no one else did. Even if we spent decades feeling invisible, we can turn inward with the compassion we deserved all along and finally say, you are here. You matter. I see you. That's not erasure of the past. It's reclamation of the present. Because the child who was ignored often becomes the adult who refuses to ignore others, who listens deeply, who notices the quiet ones, who creates the space they never had. And in that choice, messy and imperfect and brave, they discover something profound. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen, and now finally they are. If this touched something in you, share it. Someone out there might need these words today. And maybe, just maybe, they'll realize they're not alone in the silence anymore.